Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is March 27th, 2017, and we are coming to you with sort of an emergency broadcast here with some unfortunate news. Things are looking very dim in the Middle East, and they are, how should we say this? We see dark clouds gathering over the United States and Europe as well. We are going to have to focus tonight on the Syrian crisis because that is unfortunately starting to look more and more like a convergence of interests, not only NATO, but Israel, Turkey, the GCC, other interested parties in the Syrian crisis, and we're seeing this both outside of Syria and inside of Syria in terms of the Kurds and relevant terrorist-backed groups and terrorist groups, etc., that are operating there. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about some of the deep state civil war issues that are going on here in the United States. It's actually reached down now to South Carolina, and I think everybody who is listening tonight can feel and has probably been feeling the air of tension that is now pervasive. Everybody can feel that something bad is on the horizon. Now, that's not a reason to get down on yourself. That's not a reason to get quiet, to get scared. It's a reason to get active. It's also a reason to prepare. We'll talk about different ways we can do that throughout the show, hopefully, but we've got to get to the analysis. And again, I should point out that the show is actually being recorded on March 24th. Things can change in the field, and they can change in a matter of days. A lot of things can happen in a matter of days. In fact, many of the things that we're going to be talking about took place over just a matter of days, in a matter of weeks. But now they're converged to become a growing concern, to say the least. But bear that in mind as you're listening to the information. If something's not right up to the minute, then we might have perhaps some lag in terms of the information. And the show is going to be broadcasting, of course, 9 o'clock on March 27th. So you can catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night at 9 o'clock. Eastern Standard Time on UCY.tv. The show is being rebroadcast on this network throughout the week, and of course being posted up at BrandonTurbeville.com and a number of other websites, including Activist Post. If you're interested in my work, you can check out ActivistPost.com, NaturalBlaze.com, ArrowOfWisdom.org, and of course BrandonTurbeville.com. That is the website where you need to be going in any event to catch up on my work. All of it's there. All of the articles that I've done, the interviews, the YouTube videos, the archives of this show, the books, that's all available at BrandonTurbeville.com. Very easy site to navigate, and I highly encourage you to do so. Now, last week we talked about the Syrian crisis. It seems we're talking about the Syrian crisis just about every week now, and I think we need to go back over some of what we discussed. The question now of what is happening in Syria, and the world has become such a complex place. It's always was, I suppose, but in terms of the interests that are existing over the Syrian crisis, but also interests within the American deep state. Now, I hate to even use the term deep state now because certain Republican crews are using the term, and that waters it down and makes it clownish. But what else? What other name do we have for it? This was a term that I believe was coined by Peter Dale Scott. I believe it's Peter Dale Scott, and he's no Republican, and of course he's no conspiracy theorist, a legitimate researcher there. Now, we're going to talk about the Syrian crisis, and then we're going to try to round everything back up to bring it back to the deep state questions, and this is going to be very difficult to follow, and I apologize for that, but there's a lot of interest here in existence. We're going to jump right into it, and hopefully people can follow along and pay attention and follow with us. Now, early on, the Trump administration, Donald Trump, had ordered the U.S. military to come up with a plan to confront and destroy ISIS, not only in Syria but in Iraq as well, across the world. That plan is now revealing itself to be not only a carbon copy of Obama's plan, but it's also something that is more intense, as we are seeing it play out inside the country. We saw that the United States is considering the deployment of up to 1,000 American soldiers to northern Syria under the guise of shoring up the offensive to retake Raqqa. And a number of the U.S. Forces there, according to sources coming from the Kurds, they're claiming 1,000 American soldiers to back up Kurdish fighters in that battle. Now, the campaign trail saw Trump talking about the possibility of, having a more rational approach to the Syrian crisis and Russian relations. He accused Hillary of being dangerous. Her plan was dangerous, claimed that she would lead to World War III, and he was right. But his new plan very much looks like Obama's, and sort of a toned-down version of Hillary's plan for just incinerating the world. Now, the deployment has taking place around the same time that we have another new Trump policy which is coming into place, which eliminates the troop caps that were a holdover from the Obama administration for forces operating in Iraq and Syria. We should also mention that essentially what this would mean is that under Obama there was this tendency to deploy troops, but to make sure that the numbers weren't as large, so to avoid the kind of Bush-era open invasions, direct invasions, and rekindle thoughts of that, draw too much attention. Trump is now eliminating that policy, which allows the United States military to make that decision. And you can make an argument for if you're going to send a group of soldiers into a war zone, they should be able to react and engage in military operations in the way that they train. So if they train with 25 soldiers, they should have 25 soldiers on the ground. But sometimes those desires of the military do not match the desires and goals of the civilian administration. And in the United States, not being a military dictatorship, the civilian government always trumps the military, and that is something that I think many right-wingers need to get through their thick skulls, which is we are not a military dictatorship. You do not have to be in the military to be president. The military doesn't control the direction of the country. It's the civilian government. But that's another topic of discussion. The question of Raqqa, this is sort of I've defined it as the race to Raqqa, because what we are essentially doing is racing the Syrian military and the Russians, as well as Iran and Hezbollah, for which one of us can liberate the city of Raqqa. Now, we're now seeing tensions rising between Syria, between Israel, between Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, and of course the United States. And now the U.S. is upping the ante in Syria. We've mobilized troops. I say we. The United States has mobilized troops to Manbij. They're engaging in a series of airstrikes. We had this questionable report of the U.S. bombing a mosque in Jina. If you listened to the show last week and read my article on it, I'm actually not convinced the United States bombed that mosque. But there's been another report of an American bombing of a school in Al-Mansra. Now, this is more substantiated. I believe there are pictures of that school being damaged, and there were a number of people being killed there. I think maybe 30. There was also the intensification of a direct military participation in Syria. We have this airlift of American service personnel, Kurdish fighters, and moderate cannibals to an area very near Raqqa, the de facto ISIS capital. On March 22nd, the Pentagon announced that members of the SDF were airdropped behind enemy lines in an area close to the Tabqa Dam, which is located, it's west of Raqqa. And the dam is thought to be populated by hundreds of foreign fighters, and reports are suggesting that there's a battle currently raging near the dam. And in fact, the last reports that I've got, and again tonight is March 24th, the last reports that I have are that the Kurdish forces are claiming that they actually have liberated the dam, but ISIS is denying it. So we'll have to see. The announcement was made about this airdrop at the 68-member U.S.-led coalition meeting in Washington. We had Secretary of State Rex Tillerson saying it's only a matter of time before ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is killed. We have a BBC report here telling us that the Pentagon declined to say how many U.S. aircraft had been used to airlift Arab members of the Kurdish-led SDF close to the Tabqa Dam on the river Euphrates, some 45 kilometers, that's 28 miles west of Raqqa, a key stronghold of ISIS. Okay, well, the SDF forces are a mixture of Kurdish fanatics and beardist jihadist freaks. Now, BBC says the assault, conducted during darkness early on Wednesday, took ISIS militants based there by surprise, it said. Aside from being strategically important and providing electricity to the region, the dam is believed to be used by ISIS foreign fighters to plot attacks outside Syria, according to the Pentagon. There's also a town, a military airfield, and a prison holding ISIS hostages nearby. Reports are also suggesting that this is only the beginning and that the United States is about to step up its involvement in Syria, at least in terms of direct military intervention. Now, again, as I mentioned, the Kurdish groups that the U.S. are openly claiming now that the U.S. is set to contribute 1,000 troops to assist the SDF in their attempt to retake or to take Raqqa. The reports of the airlift came on the same day that the U.S. committed another war crime, right? This one is the school in Al-Mansura, which is in the western countryside of Aleppo province. Al-Badia School. This was a makeshift shelter for internally displaced Syrians. In this case, it housed 40 families from Aleppo's countryside, also from Palmyra and Raqqa. Tens of people were killed. I don't have an exact number, and the school was apparently totally destroyed. We have a quote from Afra Dogger, who's been on the show a number of times. She wrote in her article about it, she says, in October 2015, our ambassador Jafari explained to U.S. audiences that Raqqa is a city of 800,000 civilians hostage to 3,000 foreign-funded terrorists. And so our government was careful with bombing missions to not harm our civilians. The U.S.-led coalition doesn't care how many of us it murders. That's true. Now, the question of Raqqa, why is this sudden interest in Raqqa? This part's fairly simple. The U.S. clearly sees that the Syrian military and Syria's allies, Russia especially, are going to liberate Raqqa soon enough, and the U.S. does not want to suffer another public relations setback. A defeat for ISIS is a humiliation for the United States, and that fact alone should get people thinking. The United States wants to have its own victory in Raqqa before the Syrians and the Russians can have theirs. If the SDF is able to take Raqqa, the U.S. is then going to be able to shout from the rooftops that America has liberated Raqqa and defeated ISIS in its own capital. And there's also another goal: the theft of more Syrian territory by using proxy forces, in this case the SDF. Whether or not ISIS proper is in control of Raqqa, that's a secondary concern for the United States. If the SDF succeeds in imposing control over the city and the province, then the West is going to have succeeded in cementing control over the area in the hands of proxy terrorists one more time, but with another incarnation of the same Western-backed jihadist fanaticism with a Kurdish element put in there for the mix. The U.S. can then use the moderate rebel or Kurd label to keep Russia and Syria from bombing them, this group who just assumed a position that was handed to them, even though it was through some level of violence by ISIS. Now, with the situation as it stands, there's the very real possibility of some type of major confrontation taking place in Raqqa that could very well have international ramifications. On one hand, there's the Syrian military, backed by the Russian Air Force and Russian Special Forces, headed north and east to Raqqa. On the other hand, there is the SDF, right, backed by the U.S. Air Force, Special Forces, heading south and west toward Raqqa. And both sides are in a race to gain control over the ISIS capital, gain territory, and declare victory for everybody to see. But what if they arrive in Raqqa at the same time? In other words, we have a distinct possibility here that in this race for Raqqa, the Syrian-Russian alliance might find itself face-to-face with the U.S. SDF alliance. And at that point, the question is going to be, who's going to back down if either of them are going to back down? And if both forces decide to push forward, the result could be devastating not only for Syria but for the rest of the world. Now, regardless of what happens, it's important to remember that the Syrian military is acting entirely in self-defense against the terrorists that we are calling rebels, against the United States, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah. They've all been invited into Syria. They've all acted legally. They've all acted with the permission of the Syrian government. The United States and its coalition are acting completely outside of international law in an attempt to shore up terrorists and proxies. And once again, the United States and its coalition of the willing is pushing the patience of the rest of the world. But now we have something else going on in Syria in terms of inter-Syrian issues. The Trump administration's plan for Syria was vague early on, but as time has progressed, we are now being shown that U.S. policy is continuation of the policy that was in place before Trump took office. In other words, the new boss looks a lot like the old boss in Syria. And we have an open and increased support for Kurdish fanatics and related Arab elements, and that means terrorists. It's posing a new problem regarding the possibility of federalization. Kurdish fanatics are interested in only one thing. That's independence and creating their own Kurdish state that eventually crosses the border of Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. They're not interested so much in fighting terrorists since they've been allied with terrorists themselves so they can achieve their own goals. But the U.S. and Russia, they're not openly discussing the prospect of federalizing Syria, but the idea of an autonomous Kurdish area, which is currently being referred to by the Kurds as Rojava, is incredibly dangerous, and it's an unjustified policy. Before 2013, Rojava was never an autonomous region, and there was never a separate Kurdish entity in Syria. The Kurdish areas are occupied by many more religions and ethnicities than Kurds, including Syrian Arabs, Assyrians, Turkmen, we could go on and on. In January 2014, the PYD, which is the Democratic Union Party, declared all three Rojavan cantons autonomous. This was Afrin, Kobane, or Ain al-Arab, and Jazira. The Rojava Interim Constitution, which is called the Charter of the Social Contract, came immediately after that. And the charter called for the peaceful coexistence of all religion and ethnic groups that were under the jurisdiction and reaffirmed that Rojava would remain part of Syria. In other words, autonomy. Turkey opposes that move, and it has fears that the Syrian Kurds are going to be able to get together and start representing a significant threat on its borders. And more importantly to Turkey, the Syrian Kurds might unite with the Turkish Kurds and then start bringing territory back away from Turkey. The legitimate Syrian government has also rejected any federalization plans for obvious reasons. We had Bashar al-Jafari, head of the Syrian government delegation in the United Nations Geneva talks, quoted as saying, quote, "Drawing any lines between Syrians would be a great mistake." He also pointed out the Syrian Kurds are an important part of the Syrian people, the olive branch there. But now, leaving the question of the legitimacy of a Kurdistan or Kurdish autonomous zone aside for a while and acknowledging the heroism of the Kurds in their fight against ISIS and Nusra and other terrorist forces. Well, you got to point out that the Kurds have had some very unsavory allies in the process. Most notably, we have the United States and the Free Syrian Army, which are proxy terrorists of the U.S. and NATO, and of course they are barbarians. They're actually really horrific. Now, the United States has been tacitly supporting the Kurdish fighters in Iraq for some time under the pretext of assisting them in their fight against ISIS, despite the fact that the United States has armed, trained, funded, facilitated, directed ISIS from the beginning. The United States has allegedly stopped short of directly arming the Kurds. Well, they had stopped short of directly arming the Kurds, but now it's maintained very close ties with them, and they actually have sent them supplies and armed them. So some people might even argue that with the exception of the ISIS fighters themselves, the Kurds have more friendly relations with the U.S. than the Iraqi government. Now, the arming of the Kurds directly in Iraq, along with the Sunni forces, creates the perception of a fully separate and independent principality, free from control of the Iraqi central government, and that leads to the breakup of the country as a whole into three separate entities, which is a Kurdish segment, Sunni segment, and Shiite segment. We also have a plan that has been in the works for Iraq, and if the U.S. continues its support of Kurds in Syria, the situation is moving in that direction. The creation of a Kurdistan entity across the borders of Iraq and Syria, much like the plan to break up Iraq into three separate parts. That we have a similar plan devised for Syria in the absence of total destruction, the Libya model. So the question of accepting arms might, from the Kurdish perspective, might be explained by the gold is where you find it. The fact is that the YPG is now working directly with the Free Syrian Army. It's further evidence of collusion between NATO, U.S., and YPG. You can present the Kurdish fanatics, and you can present the FSA, for instance, as mainstream Western press tends to do, present the FSA as a moderate. But the FSA is nothing more than Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and al-Nusra. It's the same thing. There's no such thing as a moderate rebel in Syria. There never has been. The FSA is documented to have committed massive atrocities, and the groups that are controlled by the United States are intent upon implementing Sharia law on the subjugated populations. I and a number of other researchers have documented this fact. The FSA is nothing more than a wing of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and has even publicly stated that it's worked with both of those groups in the past. So the fact that the YPG is willing to cooperate with the FSA is telling, but the fact that the FSA would be willing to cooperate with the YPG is even more telling. Remember, the Iraqi Kurds have been connected to U.S. intelligence and military operations in the past. We have an increase of signs of cooperation between the YPG and the Iraqi Kurds, the Peshmerga. We can only wonder if the events that are transpiring on the ground now in relation to the Kurds in Syria, Iraq, and Turkey are part of an overarching U.S. plan to finally carve out a geographic pound of flesh from Iraq and Syria. Unfortunately for the Kurds, the history of their own community and the U.S. has been definitely one of short-term usefulness and treachery. In fact, I don't think the Kurds have ever benefited from supporting American actions or working in the service of U.S. geopolitical agendas, whether wittingly or unwittingly. In almost every single circumstance, we've seen the Kurds providing yeoman service in the name of destabilization and the strategy of tension, but they've been left holding the bag in the end. And that bag almost always contains horrific slaughter and then subsequent oppression of the Kurdish people. They think they'd get this through their heads by now. Now, I don't support federalization at all, and I'll just give you a couple of reasons. The Kurdish population is not a majority in the areas even that the PYD are trying to annex. In the past few years, we've seen that the PYD and the YPG are not beyond carrying out ethnic cleansing of non-Kurdish minorities in order to basically change the demographics. The main threat to Kurdish ethnocentric territorial claims over the area are the other large minorities, the Arabs and the Assyrian Christians. We have Salih Muslim, who is the head of the PYD. He openly declared his intention to conduct an ethnic cleansing campaign against Syrian Arabs who live in what he calls Rojava. He said, "One day those Arabs who have been brought to the Kurdish areas will have to be expelled." He did that in an interview with Serik TV. You can see that. Over 2 years, that interview was. I think we have the YPG now being seen burning Arab villages around Al-Hasaka province. We see they were trying to create a demographic shift there. It's estimated about 10,000 Arab villagers have been ethnically cleansed from Al-Hasaka so far. And the villages around Tal Abyad have suffered the most. We've got Kurdish expansionists now seeking to connect the discontiguous population centers of Al-Hasaka and Al-Raqqa. We have Muhammad Salih Al-Khati, who left Tel Thiab Sharki, which is near Ras Al Ain, in December. He says, "The YPG burnt our village and looted our houses." Well, that's your American freedom fighters. Every time the United States comes up with a freedom fighter, they tend to do a lot of house burning and ethnic cleansing and atrocities. We have the YPG, of course, beginning a campaign of intimidation, of murder, of property confiscation against the Assyrian Christian minority. The YPG and the PYD both made it a formal policy to loot and confiscate the property of the people who'd escaped their villages after an ISIS attack in the hope of repopulating Assyrian villages with Kurds. And the Assyrian residents of the Kabur area in Al-Asaka formed a militia called the Kabur Guard, and it was in the hope of defending their villages against ISIS. The Kabur Guard, the council leaders, protested the practice of looting by the Kurdish YPG militia who had looted the villages, but the YPG assassinated the leader, who was David Jindo, and they attempted to assassinate Elias Nasser, but he survived. And it's ironic, the YPG blamed the assassination on ISIS, but he survived. He was able to expose their involvement from his hospital bed. And since the assassination, the YPG forced the Kabur Guard to disarm and accept the YPG protection. Of course, once they disarmed, as is always the case, the Assyrian residents of Kabur who fled to the Syrian army-controlled areas of Kamlishi couldn't return to their villages, and they wouldn't let them in. So Kamlishi actually has also seen a number of incidents of harassment by YPG. The YPG attacked an Assyrian checkpoint. They killed one Assyrian fighter. It was the Assyrian militia Soturo, and they had wounded 3 other people. The checkpoint was set up after 3 Assyrian restaurants were bombed in an attack that killed 14 civilians, and it's suspected that the YPG was behind that. They were trying to assassinate Assyrian leaders. We could go on, but it's foolish to ignore the signs that more widely spread ethnic cleansing campaigns might occur if these Kurdish expansionists are supported, especially since other ethnic groups are not on board with their federalism plans and are not on board with their bizarre cultural Marxist version of communism, their idiotic brainwashing. It's only been 90 years since the Assyrian genocide, which was conducted by Turks and Kurds, and the history shouldn't be allowed to be repeated. Assyrians have enjoyed safety and stability in the Syrian state since that time, right? Forcing the Assyrians to accept federalism is not going to ensure their safety. It's going to do them harm. These other groups should be protected from the Kurds as well. I highly encourage you to find an article by Maram Susli, Syrian girl, Why a Kurdish Enclave in Syria is a Very Bad Idea, and read that article over, and I think you'll see my point and see hers as well. It's a very well written article. Now, what do I mean by federalism? That's prospect of federalism, which I think is really inappropriately named. It was floated first during the Obama administration by John Kerry, who described it as his Plan B. It sounded, of course, much like the Plan A of a number of other strategists and policymakers and imperialist organs, like the members of mainstream media, corporate financier think tanks, and Zbigniew Brzezinski. We have Michael O'Hanlon, who wrote an article for Reuters, Syria's One Hope May Be as Dim as Bosnia's Once Was, and he suggests that the way to end the Syrian crisis is to agree between the United States and Russia to a weakened and divided Syria that's broken up into separate pieces. I'm going to read from his article, then we'll comment, but I want you to start thinking about what he's saying and what's happening now in Syria. To find common purpose with Russia, Washington should keep in mind the Bosnia model devised to end the fierce Balkan conflicts in the 1990s. In that 1995 agreement, a weak central government was set up to oversee 3 largely autonomous zones. In similar fashion, a future Syria could be a confederation of several actors, one largely Alawite, Assad's own sect, spread along the Mediterranean coast, another Kurdish along the north and northeast corridors near the Turkish border, a third primarily Druze in the southwest, a fourth largely made up of Sunni Muslims, and then a central zone of intermixed groups in the country's main population belt from Damascus to Aleppo. The last zone would likely be difficult to stabilize, but others might not be so tough. Under such an arrangement, Assad would ultimately have to step down from power in Damascus. As a compromise, however, he would perhaps remain leader of the Alawite sector. A weak central government would replace him, but most of the power, as well as most of the armed forces, would reside within the individual autonomous sectors and belong to the various regional government. In this way, ISIL could be targeted collectively by all sectors. Once this sort of deal is reached, international peacekeepers would likely be needed to hold it together, as in Bosnia. Russian troops could help with this mission, stationed, for example, along the Alawite region's borders. This deal is not, of course, ripe for negotiation. To make it plausible, moderate forces must first be strengthened. The West also needs to greatly expand its training and arming of various opposition forces that do not include ISIL or al-Nusra. Vetting standards might also have to be relaxed in various ways. American and other foreign trainers would need to deploy inside Syria, where the would-be recruits actually live, and must stay if they are to protect their families. Meanwhile, regions now accessible to international forces, starting perhaps with the Kurdish and Druze sectors, could begin receiving humanitarian relief on a much expanded scale. Over time, the number of accessible regions would grow as moderate opposition forces are strengthened. Though it could take many months or even years to achieve the outcome Washington wants, setting out the goals and the strategy now is crucial. Doing so could provide a basis for the West working together with, or at least not working against, other key outside players in the conflict, including Russia as well as Turkey, the Gulf states, and Iraq. Now, O'Hanlon is no stranger to the partition plan, especially for Syria. He was the author of a Brookings Institution report you should also look up, Deconstructing Syria, a New Strategy for America's Most Hopeless War, back in June 2015. He argued for about the same thing. Brookings, of course, corporate financier-funded think tank that's been instrumental in promoting the war against Syria since very early on in the conflict. He argued for the relaxation of vetting processes for rebels being funded by the U.S. government. He argued for the direct invasion of Syria by NATO and for the complete destruction of the Syrian government. He wanted safe zones being created as a prelude to all of those things. But he also mentioned the creation of a confederal Syria, and this is from that article from Brookings. He says, quote, "The end game for these zones would not have to be determined in advance. The interim goal might be a confederal Syria with several highly autonomous zones and a modest eventual national government. The confederation would likely require support from an international peacekeeping force if this arrangement could ever be formalized by accord. But in the short term, the ambitions would be lower. To make these zones defensible and governable, to help provide relief for populations within them, and to train and equip more recruits so that the zones could be stabilized and then gradually expanded." Now, That plan is, of course, reminiscent of Zbigniew-Brzezinski, which is the micro-states and mini-states method, using the weakness and constant tension with other micro-states and mini-states to prevent them from ever becoming a legitimate challenge to imperial power. In other words, the construction of a weak, impotent state based on ethnicity or religion or identity politics it's small, but it does not have the ability to resist the will of larger nations or these coalitions or banking industrial corporations, etc. So the Syrian Kurdish forces, whether willingly or not, they've essentially played right into the hands of the architects of plans currently underway to destroy and degrade their own country, already set in power by NATO. Now, what would this look like? The Syrian stands, right? We've all got the possibility of a Kurdistan in northern Syria, the boundaries of which have been declared by the Syrian Kurds themselves, essentially set up with a line drawn up by Western strategists and war designers many years ago. But we've also got public suggestions that have been made at least since 2013 that in addition to Kurdistan, we'd have an Alawite enclave, perhaps led by Assad, perhaps not, in the western portion of Syria, predominantly around Latakia. What's left of the Syrian government, of course, would be there. And of course, we have Robin Wright of the U.S. Institute for Peace, which is a military-industrial complex firm that's dedicated to strategic development. She wants a larger Alawitistan stretching from the south up from Damascus, from the south to Damascus, Homs, Hama, Latakia, and onto the coast of the Mediterranean. She calls for a Druzistan. Jabal al-Druz is what she wants to call it. It's been dreamed up for the southern tip of Syria, near Dara. In the rural areas, they want a Sunnistan that would span from rural central and eastern Syria across the border into central, western, and eastern Iraq. And others have suggested the Sunnistan might be a function of Syria alone. Some of them have even suggested an appeasement of terrorism, essentially by the formation of a Wahhabistan between Iraq and Syria, essentially the same territory now that's occupied by ISIS, and that they would say would function as a barrier between moderate and anti-NATO forces in Iraq and Syria, and would cut off a supply route for Syria and Hezbollah coming from Iran or what would be left of Syria. So there's that. We don't need to go through all the details of it. We'll just point out that John Bolton, the neocon, has also suggested federalization of Syria. And I'm not going to spend too much time on talking about the specifics of what federalism would look like. I've written about it. We've talked about it many different times. But look at what we have. Look at the article by Michael O'Hanlon and what it suggested, that it would take cooperation between Russia and the United States to create a federalization of Syria. Now, is that out of the question? This is something that we've got to think about. It's very unpleasant and it's frightening to consider, and especially if you're Syrian. But what is the possibility here that the Russians and the United States are cooperating? Certainly it would be a de-escalation in terms of World War III, but it would be a de-escalation that would sacrifice Syria. Now let's look again quickly at the timeline of events. We have the U.S. mobilization of troops near Manbij with the Kurdish forces. They essentially act to keep the Syrian military from taking over many towns in that area. Now, we don't have confirmation if there was no transition of power between the Kurds to the Syrian military, or if those villages were transferred, but essentially the American operation halted Manbij itself from being turned over to the SAA. But regardless, it stopped the progress of the Syrian military in this portion of northern Syria. Then we have an Israeli airstrike deep into Syrian government territory out near Palmyra, which is deep into Syria. The Israelis claimed they were targeting Hezbollah, still illegal if they were doing that, but then the Syrian military says no, they were targeting Syrian military installations. The Israelis turned to leave. The Syrians open their air defense systems, fire a shot, take out an Israeli jet. The Syrians, of course, say they took out the jet. The Israelis say they don't. I assume that they did. The Israelis rarely, if ever, admit any kind of defeat on the field for strategic purposes. And the Syrians stated that this decision was taken after they informed the Russian military of their plans. So they didn't ask permission from the Russians, but they informed the Russians that they were going to shoot down the Israeli plane, and it is assumed, there have been no reports to the contrary, that the Russians agreed, that the Russians acknowledged and did not protest the shoot down. Syria gave a speech the next day, or actually shortly after that, and said that this agreement with Putin, that Putin himself, in fact, Bashar al-Jafari actually said Putin himself has sent a message to Israel that unilateral attacks on Syria, bombing Syrian territory, would no longer be tolerated. Well, what happens only 24 hours after that is that an Israeli drone conducts an airstrike on the Lebanese-Syrian border. An hour or so later, an Israeli military jet also bombs a target on the Lebanese-Syrian border. Israeli drone is then flown over Syrian territory, which the Syrians do shoot down and bring down. But yet there's more attacks. The Syrian military, the Israeli military, launches more attacks near Damascus, but they don't get shot down. So what does that mean? We don't know yet. Part of the discussion here, why did the Israelis get shot down? Why did they not get shot down later? The Israelis have targeted convoys. They've targeted Syrian military installations in the past. They've done it now, 14 times? If you count these as separate incidents. 14 times in Syria. And they haven't been shot down except this once. Why haven't they been shot down? Well, it looks like the strategy of Israel is to send in a small number of jets aimed at a specific target, but designed to do two things. One, of course, is to hit the target. The other is to force Syria to light up its air defense systems so that Israel knows where they are. In other words, 2 Israeli jets come in to destroy a convoy. What can you afford to lose, your air defense systems or your convoy? The Israelis want to keep picking and picking and picking until the Syrians finally light up their air defense systems and they know where they're at. The Israelis, in fact, actually said the next time the Syrians fire anti-aircraft missiles at them, they would destroy their air defenses. The Syrians have been reluctant to do so because they don't want the Israelis to know where their air defense systems are at. So it's likely that after the shoot-down, which may have caught Israel unaware, that the subsequent attacks were not shot down, although the drone was shot down. There was a drone that was shot down, but the other planes were not shot down, perhaps because the Syrians are still aware of what the Israelis are trying to do. It's kind of a cat and mouse game. But, of course, the question of Russia. Russia does not protest, as the Syrians say they're going to shoot an Israeli jet down. That's good, but one of the other things that we did not see Donald Trump out on stage with an Israeli flag and a sword, leading a crusade with a Bible in one hand and screaming about the Promised Land and the Holocaust and all this kind of stuff, screaming that we would fight and die to the last American to protect Israel. We didn't see that. You would have seen it with Bush. You would have seen it with Obama. We didn't see it with Trump. So what does that mean? Apparently, it could suggest that there was a bit of an understanding between the Trump administration and the Putin administration. It could also suggest that perhaps there was an understanding between the Trump administration and the Israeli government. It could also mean that Trump is not quite as willing to go to bat for Israel as much as he at first claimed. It could mean many different things. We're not clear exactly what it means. Now, we also have Turkish forces operating deeper inside Syria, exchanging fire with the Kurds, of course. The United States is there now acting as a buffer zone. Now, what we also have is Rex Tillerson saying that he is looking forward to creating safe zones in Syria for civilians, of course, always for the civilians. It wouldn't need to create safe zones for civilians in the first place if the United States hadn't funded terrorists to kill civilians. But we have that. Now, the United States now engaging airlifts, picking up Kurds and dropping them behind enemy lines, essentially. And the Kurds and SDF terrorists are now trying to retake Raqqa from ISIS. So we've already been over what this would mean in terms of why they're racing to Raqqa. But what's been the Russian response? We don't know, but we do know that they're essentially carving out a Kurdistan in Syria. This is something that the Syrian government has been steadfast in opposing. They've said we don't want federalization of Syria, but the Russians have attempted to push federalization a couple of times, even in that horrible draft constitution, showing that the Russian sensibility of individual freedom and freedom of speech and expression is still mired down in years of communism and Stalin and Khrushchev and the cultural malaise that they've had ever since the revolution, the great communist Marxist revolution, which essentially crushed everything in Russia for a number of years, for decades. It put them in the dark ages. That's still lingering, unfortunately. Looking at that draft constitution, what a pile of garbage. The Syrians rejected Kurdish federalization. They rejected a couple of other things, as well they should. This was crap. This constitution is crap, and it should be gotten rid of. And I'm glad they got rid of those points. But the Russians have repeatedly given credence to Kurdish autonomy, and again, I say this is not good. This is simply trying to impose cultural Marxist stupidity on a people who have an aversion to this, who are not used to this type of insanity. And the Kurds simply don't deserve it. They don't need their own land just because they are obsessed with their own ethnicity, obsessed with Marx, obsessed with feminism and stuff. They can obsess over those things in the confines of the modern state and individual freedoms of speech and expression, but they can't take rights away from other people. We don't have cultural and actual physical genocide simply because some people are obsessed with the color of their own skin, the shape of their own facial structure, and the strange and bizarre interpretation of Marxist theory into the culture and gender. It's all a load of bullocks, as they would say in Europe or in England. So the other question is what's happening is that the United States is attempting to federalize Syria. It's fairly obvious. The question, however, is whether or not the Russians are willing to do it also. Are the Russians working with the United States here? Has Syria been betrayed? And that's what a lot of people are concerned about right now. There is evidence to the contrary. There's evidence for that. I'm not making a claim either way, but something here is most definitely wrong. Now, we could talk about solutions for Syria. We should do that, but we're not in a position right now to talk about solutions because the crisis is heating up. The question of the American deep state and the possibility of a deep state civil war we're seeing playing out here in the United States. It goes back. It's more than the Flynn resignation now. We've also got the FBI launching probes into this stupid idea of Russian involvement in U.S. elections. Now they're investigating Trump. They're investigating members of Trump's team. And by the way, Kellyanne Conway, the woman who looks like Beavis, she is maybe not the sharpest tool in the shed, but she gets a lot of ridicule from leftists because leftists are good at that. They ridicule people. Even when they're making themselves look absolutely retarded, they're still laughing. Another sign of insanity and stupidity is to laugh at someone when you're making a fool of yourself. But Kellyanne Conway says that microwaves could be listening to you. Well, I'm sorry, mainstream media and Democrats, but your microwave is capable of listening to you. If it's a smart microwave, then yeah, it's all part of the smart technology control grid. Go back and read my articles from 4 or 5 years ago, the smart grid technocracy, smart grid control grid, stuff like that. You'll find it where the Internet of Things, it was actually talked about by David Petraeus of how the Internet of Things could be used to suck up all the data and essentially control the population, and that includes microwaves. So you guys might be Luddites and might not understand technology, but the rest of the world and the people who created it do understand it. The question of whether or not Trump was surveilled, well, yeah, of course he was surveilled. There's a FISA warrant for the Trump Towers that was rejected. The first one was rejected, yes, but the second one was accepted. And why is this so strange, right? Why is this so strange? The Obama administration wiretapped 300 million people. Yeah, he wiretapped Trump. I'm not concerned in the least by saying this. 300 million people are getting their data sucked up illegally into the NSA. Donald Trump was one of them. So once again, the people on the left here who are laughing and joking, just making fools of yourselves. We also have the question of if the U.S. government wasn't monitoring the Trump team. Do riddle me this: who listened in on Michael Flynn's conversation then? Where did that information come from? Was it the Russians? Was it the Russians who listened to Michael Flynn and then gave Michael Flynn's conversation to the media to expose the Russians? Was that a Russian suicide attack? What is this? And we also, U.S. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Devin Nunes has said that the U.S. intelligence intercepted and unmasked Trump team communications on numerous occasions and produced dozens of reports that were widely disseminated throughout the intelligence community. Communications of Donald Trump and his associates have been intercepted, and that the intercepts produced dozens of intelligence reports. Nunes confirmed that none of this surveillance was related to Russia or the investigation of Russian activities or of the Trump team. So there's that. Now, this is partially a deep state civil war, but only partially. And a lot of this, of course, is theater, because the song remains the same in terms of foreign policy and a lot of domestic policy. Things are remaining exactly the same. But now the deep state issues are not just between Donald Trump. It's not just between his team. It's not just between some members of Congress. It's not just between some members of the oligarchy. It's not just between parties. It's actually reaching down to places like here in South Carolina. We've had our governor is now being investigated for wrongdoing, and we're also seeing a number, I believe, of the Republican Party's chair people of the state, at the state level. The Republican Party is being investigated for, again, essentially financial wrongdoing. Not the party, it's some of the individuals in the party, but this aggressive lawyer, which maybe we could talk about
next week as we get more information on it. But you can see that there's fracturing now, even at the state level. This is South Carolina. We don't have too many political scandals here unless it involves sex. Then we get pretty uptight, unless or perhaps when we have secretaries of the Treasury doing a bunch of blow in Charleston, or crashing airplanes, speeding in cars. That's the kind of stuff we deal with. But this other stuff is a new game to us. So it's fracturing down to the state level, but it's also fracturing up, and this is happening at the international level. We're looking at the French elections now coming up. Marine Le Pen, many faults in Marine Le Pen, but France actually could use a bit of a right turn. As weird as it sounds for me to say that, the words coming out of my mouth, but they could, just simply because they've been taken so far down the cultural Marxist lane that actually turning the wheel would be an improvement. Of course, France is nothing if not the epitome of a police state with absolutely no freedom of expression. Of course, I would imagine if you want to have gender surgery or some type of race vest, you could have that. But if you question certain things, then you can be put in prison. So Europe is no bastion of free speech. I say all that to say that you should watch those elections closely. That we're seeing in France what we saw in Trump, right? The right-leaning candidate of populism, cultural populism as it may be, is being maligned as a racist, as a fascist. Of course, to be labeled a racist and a fascist in 2017 simply means that you don't want to see white people put in concentration camps. In France, of course, just saying that you believe that France is a country, I believe, could get you labeled as a Nazi. But we're also seeing rifts and stuttering from Merkel in Germany. So take a look at that situation there as well. Of course, we'll be following the Russian elections when they come up. But it's very disturbing. We don't know what is happening over Syria in terms of, has there been an international agreement between Putin and Trump and the forces that back them, or is there still a rift, and are we simply waiting for Putin to play the next hand? Certainly got a better poker player than Oblabla, who didn't know his ass from a hole in the ground when it came to any kind of negotiation. So are we seeing the chessboard realigning and we're waiting for the next player's move, or has there been an agreement and has Syria been betrayed and stabbed in the back? We'll see. We're going to keep following this, ladies and gentlemen. We're coming to the end of the show. We say prayers for Syria. We really are concerned about where this is going to lead. It's a very dark time in Syria for many of us who are watching this situation and seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. It's very frustrating and heartbreaking to watch things being just wrenched from us like this, and especially for the Syrian people who've lost so much and are going to continue to lose even more because of imperialism and the idea that some people have the right to the belongings and the lives of others. This is unconscionable. It has to be stopped. So keep tuning in. Please keep going to BrandonTurbeville.com. Please get active. We need you in action. The people of Syria need you in action. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
They told us to pack up our bags and head south. They said that the luck of the Irish ran out. Told us they burned down our farms and our stores. They cursed us for cowards and our wives for whores. Our brother John was out plowing the field. A proof of
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.